Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has this Wednesday been addressing newly elected members of parliament as well as mayors. It all comes following closely fought presidential and parliamentary elections on Sunday. Well, those presidential elections will now go to a runoff on May 28 between Erdogan and his rival Kemal Kilicdaroglu. Neither candidate then obtained the 50% of votes needed to avoid a second round. Well, meanwhile, Kilicdaroglu has been meeting with members of his six-party alliance to discuss how to halt Erdogan's 2 decades in power. On Sunday, the opposition deprived Erdogan of a first-round victory for the first time. Well, this year's election largely centred on domestic issues such as the economy, civil rights and a February earthquake that killed more than 50,000 people. Let's talk more about the elections and the earthquake. I'm joined here in the studio by France 24's reporter Nadia Massih. Nadia, in terms of the elections, you were there, you were covering from the disaster zone. Turnout was high despite that. 1 million people had been displaced, but people still showed up to vote.
Yeah, absolutely. Turnout's always high in Turkish elections, Rochelle. And in this election, nationally, 87% of people voted. Huge. But in Hatay, the region most affected by the earthquake, nonetheless, 83% of people went out to vote. And that meant that tens of thousands of people commuted back to the place that they had survived in order to cast their ballot. I have to say, I found it actually very moving. You know, we were talking to people there who were saying, this is the first time I've been back since the earthquake. I survived. You know, a woman told me I was underground for several days. I came back because it was so important for me to cast my ballot. People in that country take their democratic responsibility really seriously. Another man telling me, a first-time voter, he had made the effort to go back and vote. It took him 10 hours, he did so, he said, in order to honour those who had died in the quake.
I mean, it's just astounding to see the determination of Turks to go back to these very difficult places to cast their ballot. I mean, it's fair to say, Nadia, if we look at the earthquake region, President Erdogan did lose some support there, but essentially not enough to lose this election.
Yeah, that's right. People might be surprised to know that in the worst affected cities in the zone, like Antakya, Kahramanmaraş, Erdogan beat his opponent by a pretty significant amount. In Kahramanmaraş, for example, he won 71% of the vote. So why did he do so well in those areas, even though there is plenty of evidence that the death toll would have been lower had construction rules and regulations been followed properly, and that responsibility for that can be traced all the way up to the presidency itself? Well, the epicenter of the quakes was beneath Erdogan's heartlands. I'm talking about religious, rural, conservative parts of Turkey. People in those areas telling us, you know, until Erdogan came to power 20 years ago, they didn't feel represented. They didn't feel heard by the national government. And during the campaign, Erdogan was quite successful in convincing people that this was an unprecedented natural disaster that no government could have been ready for. And crucially, he says he'll rebuild within a year. Now, 3 months have elapsed. I was there in February, just after the quake. I was obviously there again this week. I have to say, I personally haven't seen any evidence of that rebuilding yet. Nowhere in Antakya, the city is livable for the moment. But clearly, his message cut through and the opposition's message did not.
On France 24, Nadia, we've been following this election closely. We will work together on Sunday. I mean, the opposition were incredibly confident going into this, rightfully so to a certain extent, because, yes, this is the first time that presidential elections in Turkey are going to a second round. What ultimately went wrong, though? Where did this confidence kind of fall short?
Yeah, well, they were confident because if you remember, the polling ahead of the election said actually Kilicdaroglu, the opposition candidate, was ahead. He was expected to win. And I think one thing that went wrong for them, arguably, was identity politics in Turkey. Kilicdaroglu was backed by the main Kurdish party in the country that didn't field their own candidate because actually that candidate is in prison right now. And it is clear that that support by the Kurds has cost Kilicdaroglu pretty clearly because the third candidate in the presidential race, a man called Sinan Oğan, he's very anti-Kurdish in his rhetoric. He's an ultra-nationalist in Turkey and he did extremely well, far better than the polling predicted. So that clearly was a sign that perhaps voters weren't ready for someone who was so explicitly endorsed by the Kurds. Another important thing to note when it comes to identity politics is that Kilicdaroglu is an Alawi. He comes from this minority Muslim sect that has been discriminated against for a very long time in Turkey. He spoke about it publicly during the campaign, and that was a gamble by Kilicdaroglu because it appears that plenty of Sunni Muslims that are the majority in Turkey, that President Erdogan represents, felt alienated and a little fearful of the idea of having an Alawi in power. So it does seem that backfired for him as well. As to the idea of whether or not the opposition can turn things around for the second round on May the 28th, I think it's going to be very difficult indeed. There are some suggestions right now that Ekrem İmamoğlu, who is the mayor of Istanbul, a very popular figure, a populist individual within Istanbul, is going to take a far more prominent role in the campaign now to try and energise it after their disappointing first round. The opposition, though, has already fired a number of senior people, including the head of polling within the party. That an indication that something has gone wrong for them. And just this afternoon, we've seen an indication of the new strategy by Kilicdaroglu. He tweeted a video that was rather more sort of hostile towards migrants, hostile towards Syrians than his campaigning had been before. So he's trying to swing to the right to win that second round, but it's going to be a real uphill battle for him, I think, because remember, Erdogan only needs to pick up another 0.5% if he is to win on May 28th.
Well, as you say, both sides working on their strategy going into this second round. Nadia, thanks very much for keeping us up to date.